Go ahead and laugh, the woman said quietly, her voice steady beneath the roar of rushing water. You might want to remember this moment later. The afternoon heat hung heavy over the street like a blanket, the kind of southern summer day where the air shimmered above the pavement and the smell of hot asphalt drifted through the block. Cars crawled past the small row of shops along Maple Avenue in Birmingham, Alabama, their engines humming low while people lingered under awnings trying to escape the sun. At the curb, a bright red fire hydrant stood open. A thick hose stretched across the sidewalk like a careless line drawn through the middle of someone's ordinary day. Officer Daniel Carter leaned casually against the side of his patrol car, one hand gripping the metal nozzle, the other resting comfortably on his belt. A slow grin spread across his face as the hose blasted a wide arc of cold water across the pavement, the stream splashing against the concrete and spraying toward the woman standing near the entrance of a small convenience store. The water darkened the sidewalk instantly, splattering against her shoes and soaking the hem of her plain gray uniform. Around them, a few bystanders had begun to slow their steps. Some watched with curious expressions. Others lifted their phones, the familiar glow of camera screens appearing one by one like small windows into the same moment. Officer Carter chuckled under his breath, clearly enjoying the attention. Look at that, he said loudly, his voice carrying across the block. Standing there like she owns the place. The woman didn't move away. Angela Brooks stood exactly where she had been a few seconds earlier, one hand holding the strap of a worn canvas bag resting against her hip. Water continued to splash across the sidewalk, droplets catching the sunlight as they scattered in the air like tiny shards of glass. Her uniform, the kind worn by hospital cleaning staff, clung damply to her sleeves, and a few strands of her dark hair had begun to stick against her cheek. Yet her posture remained calm, almost deliberate, as if she had decided long ago that this moment would not rush her. A pickup truck slowed at the intersection. A couple walking their dog stopped beside a parking meter. Even the clerk inside the convenience store leaned forward against the counter, watching through the glass door. The entire street seemed to settle into a strange pause, the steady hiss of water becoming the loudest sound in the afternoon. Carter tilted the nozzle slightly higher, sending the spray dancing across the pavement in a playful sweep. You gonna step aside or what? He called out with a smirk. Angela blinked once as a fine mist drifted across her face. She wiped a drop of water from her brow with the back of her hand, then glanced briefly at the growing semicircle of people watching from the sidewalk. Some looked amused. Some looked uncertain. A few looked uncomfortable, but said nothing. She took a slow breath, the kind that steadies a person before speaking in a quiet room. Then she lowered her gaze to the canvas bag hanging at her side. The bag looked ordinary enough, faded blue fabric with frayed stitching along the seams. The kind of bag someone might carry to work every day without thinking twice about it. Angela's fingers slipped calmly inside the opening. The movement was unhurried, almost casual, yet something about it made the laughter along the curb fade just slightly. Carter noticed it too. His grin lingered, but the nozzle lowered an inch as his eyes followed her hand. The stream of water still rushed loudly through the hose, splashing against the street and running along the curb in thin silver ribbons. Angela reached deeper into the bag, her expression composed, her shoulders relaxed despite the water pooling around her shoes. For a brief moment the entire block seemed to hold its breath, the hot Alabama sun beating down on the silent sidewalk, while one simple motion, her hand disappearing into that bag, quietly shifted the feeling in the air. Angela Brooks kept her hand inside the faded canvas bag for a moment longer than anyone expected, not rushing, not reacting to the splashing water that continued to slide across the sidewalk and collect around the edge of the curb. The mist from the hose still drifted through the hot Alabama air, catching sunlight in thin, sparkling threads that hung briefly before disappearing. Officer Daniel Carter watched her with mild curiosity now, the grin on his face still present but no longer as relaxed as it had been a few seconds earlier. The nozzle in his hand dipped slightly lower, though the hose continued to hum with pressure, sending water across the pavement in steady bursts. Around them, the small crowd that had gathered along Maple Avenue grew quieter. A man in a baseball cap lowered his phone just an inch, squinting as if trying to understand what was changing in front of him. The couple with the dog shifted closer to the parking meter, their conversation fading into silence. Even the convenience store clerk remained frozen behind the glass door, elbows on the counter, eyes fixed on the woman who had not taken a single step away. Angela finally lifted her hand out of the bag, but what she held was not what anyone expected. It was not a towel or a phone or anything dramatic that would immediately explain the calm expression on her face. Instead, she simply held a small leather card holder between her fingers, the kind people carry quietly every day without thinking twice about it. The object looked plain against the sunlight, dark brown with worn edges that suggested it had been used often. Angela glanced at it briefly, brushing away a drop of water that had landed on the surface. Then she looked up again, her gaze settling calmly on Officer Carter. The officer let out a short laugh, though it sounded thinner than before. "What is that supposed to be?" he called out, raising his voice slightly so the growing crowd could hear. The water still streamed across the sidewalk, but the playful tone in his voice was beginning to fade under something less certain. Angela did not raise her voice. She did not step forward either. Instead, she spoke in the same steady tone she had used earlier, the words clear enough to travel across the warm afternoon air without effort. "Officer Carter," she said, pronouncing his name carefully, "I think you should take a closer look before you keep going." The way she said his name caused a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Carter blinked once, the nozzle lowering another inch as he studied her face. There was no anger there, no fear either. Only the calm composure of someone who had already decided how the next few minutes would unfold. The stream of water slowed slightly as his grip adjusted, splashing now against the edge of the street instead of directly across the sidewalk. A teenager near the bus stop whispered something under his breath, but no one responded. Angela opened the leather holder with a small, deliberate motion. Sunlight flashed briefly across a polished surface inside, just enough for the nearest bystanders to notice something metallic reflecting the afternoon light. The quiet murmur that followed rippled through the small crowd, like wind passing through leaves. Carter leaned forward instinctively, his attention now fully fixed on the object in her hand. Angela held it steady, not waving it around or raising it dramatically, simply allowing it to be seen. The badge inside the holder caught the sunlight again, and beside it a laminated identification card rested in a clear slot. Angela Brooks remained standing in the same spot on the wet sidewalk, water slowly dripping from the hem of her uniform, her voice calm as she said, "You might want to shut that hose off, Officer Carter. The next part of this conversation is going to matter a lot more than you think." The stream of water weakened as Officer Daniel Carter's hand shifted on the metal nozzle, the confident posture he had carried moments earlier slowly giving way to hesitation. The hose continued to hum faintly, but the wide spray that had once splashed across the sidewalk now struck the pavement at a lower angle, sending narrow ribbons of water sliding quietly toward the gutter. Carter's eyes remained locked on the leather holder in Angela Brooks's hand. The metallic glint inside it had already caught the attention of the nearest bystanders, and a low murmur spread through the small crowd like a distant ripple moving across still water. Angela did not step forward. She simply held the holder open, the badge resting inside reflecting the warm Alabama sunlight with a steady shine that felt strangely out of place on the wet sidewalk. Beside it, the identification card remained visible in its clear slot, the printed seal and bold lettering unmistakable even from a few feet away. Carter blinked again, the smile that had once rested easily on his face now replaced by a thin line of uncertainty. "What exactly is that supposed to prove?" he said, though his voice sounded less certain than before. Angela watched him calmly, her expression composed, almost patient. "It proves," she replied evenly, "that today was not the ordinary afternoon you thought it was going to be." The quiet confidence in her tone caused several people along the curb to lean closer, their phones still raised, but now held with careful attention rather than amusement. Carter took a slow step toward her, his boots splashing lightly through the thin stream of water flowing across the pavement. As he moved closer, the details inside the holder became clearer. The badge carried a federal seal, polished and unmistakable, and the identification card beside it displayed Angela's photograph along with the words Civil Rights Division printed clearly across the top. Carter's gaze lingered there for a long second. The hose slipped slightly in his hand, and the water stream weakened again, falling into a quiet spray that barely reached the edge of the sidewalk. For a moment, the entire block seemed to pause. The passing cars at the intersection rolled by more slowly, drivers glancing toward the unusual gathering forming outside the convenience store. Angela closed the holder gently and lowered it to her side, but the calm authority in her posture remained unchanged. "I have been observing this area for several weeks," she continued, her voice steady enough that even those standing several yards away could hear each word clearly. "Patterns, interactions, how people with authority choose to use that authority when they believe no one important is watching." Carter's shoulders stiffened. The nozzle finally dropped to his side, and the last thin arc of water faded into a harmless trickle that ran quietly along the curb. He glanced briefly at the small crowd, noticing now that many of the phones were still recording. Angela Brooks stood in the center of the wet sidewalk with the same calm presence she had shown from the beginning, the faded canvas bag resting against her hip and the leather holder still in her hand. "And today," she said softly, her eyes meeting his without anger or excitement, "you gave me something very clear to document." The afternoon heat pressed down on Maple Avenue, the air suddenly still, while Officer Carter stood silent beside the now quiet hose, realizing the moment had changed in a way he had not expected. Officer Daniel Carter stood motionless for a moment beside the now quiet hose, the metal nozzle hanging loosely in his hand, while a thin stream of leftover water dripped slowly onto the pavement. The laughter that had filled the block earlier was gone, replaced by a heavy silence that seemed to press down along the storefronts of Maple Avenue. Angela Brooks remained exactly where she had been standing, her shoes still surrounded by the shallow pool of water spreading across the concrete, her faded uniform damp, but her posture calm and steady. The leather holder rested at her side now, but the image of the federal badge inside it lingered in everyone's mind. A breeze passed lightly through the street, rustling the edge of a newspaper in the convenience store window and stirring the humid Alabama air, yet no one in the small crowd moved away. Phones remained raised, capturing every second. Carter cleared his throat and shifted his weight, the confident ease he had carried earlier now replaced by careful restraint. "You are saying you are investigating this department," he said slowly, as if choosing each word with caution. Angela did not react to the tension in his voice. Instead, she glanced briefly toward the people gathered along the sidewalk, their faces reflecting curiosity, surprise, and quiet attention. Then she looked back at him. "I am saying," she replied evenly, "that every action taken by a public official can become part of a record." Her words were calm, not confrontational, yet they carried a quiet authority that settled over the scene like the warm afternoon sunlight. Carter lowered the nozzle completely now, letting the hose rest against the pavement beside his patrol car. Water continued to trickle faintly from the hydrant connection, running along the curb in a thin stream that glimmered under the sun before disappearing into the storm drain. A passing sedan slowed at the intersection, the driver leaning toward the open window to glance at the unusual gathering before continuing down the street. Carter ran a hand across the back of his neck, his eyes flicking again toward the phones pointed in his direction. A few minutes earlier, those phones had been capturing what looked like a harmless moment of public entertainment. Now they recorded something very different. Angela reached down calmly and adjusted the strap of the canvas bag resting against her hip. The bag looked even more ordinary now that the moment had shifted, the worn fabric swaying slightly as she moved. Yet there was nothing hurried in her motion. She seemed completely comfortable standing in the middle of the quiet street with dozens of eyes watching. "Officer Carter," she continued gently, "there is something important about public spaces. They remember things. Cameras remember things. People remember things." Carter did not respond immediately. His gaze moved slowly across the sidewalk, taking in the bystanders who had formed a loose half-circle around the scene. Some were strangers passing through the neighborhood. Others were shop employees who had stepped outside. But nearly all of them still held their phones steady. The air felt heavier now, the earlier amusement replaced by something closer to reflection. Angela looked toward the fire hydrant, then back at Carter. "I recommend turning the valve off completely," she said, her tone polite but unmistakably firm. Carter followed her glance and hesitated for only a second before walking toward the hydrant. He crouched down and twisted the metal valve handle until the faint pressure in the hose faded entirely. The last drops of water slid from the nozzle and disappeared into the gutter. When he stood again, the The street felt strangely quiet without the steady hiss that had filled the air before. Angela Brooks watched him calmly, the sunlight reflecting softly off the damp pavement around her feet, while the quiet crowd waited for what would happen next. Officer Daniel Carter straightened slowly after closing the hydrant valve, brushing a faint trace of dust from his hands while the quiet street watched him with new attention. The hose lay still now across the sidewalk, no longer roaring with pressure, only a thin ribbon of leftover water sliding along the curb before disappearing into the metal grate of the storm drain. The sudden silence felt almost louder than the rushing water had been moments earlier. Angela Brooks remained where she stood, the damp pavement reflecting small patches of sunlight around her shoes, while the warm Alabama air settled back over Maple Avenue. The faded canvas bag rested against her hip, and the leather holder remained in her hand, though she no longer held it open. She simply waited, calm and patient, as if the next few minutes had already been carefully measured in her mind long before this afternoon began. Carter glanced once more toward the small crowd gathered along the sidewalk. Several people shifted their weight slightly, but none of them walked away. Phones were still raised, the quiet red recording lights blinking steadily. The officer took a slow breath and walked back toward his patrol car, stopping a few feet away from Angela. The earlier grin had vanished from his face entirely. "So what happens now?" he asked, attempting to sound composed though his voice carried a thin edge of uncertainty. Angela studied him for a brief moment before answering. The expression in her eyes remained steady, neither harsh nor forgiving, simply focused. "What happens now?" she said calmly. "Depends on what you choose to do next." The words hung lightly in the warm air between them. A delivery truck rolled slowly down the opposite side of the street, the driver leaning out his window for a better look before continuing toward the intersection. Carter shifted his stance again, the polished badge on his uniform catching a flash of sunlight as he moved. "You said you were observing this area," he replied carefully. "For how long?" Angela glanced briefly toward the row of shops, then back toward him. "Long enough to understand patterns," she answered. "Long enough to notice when certain officers treat some members of the public differently than others." A quiet murmur rippled through the nearby crowd. Carter looked toward the people filming, then back at Angela. The realization that dozens of witnesses had heard every word seemed to settle on his shoulders like additional weight. Angela reached into the canvas bag again, this time pulling out a small black notebook no larger than the palm of her hand. The pages inside were filled with neat lines of writing. She flipped it open slowly, the paper rustling softly in the afternoon breeze. "Dates," she said quietly while scanning one page. "Locations. Observations." Carter watched the notebook as if it were far heavier than its size suggested. Angela closed it again and held it loosely at her side. "Every community deserves to feel respected in its own streets," she continued. "That includes the people standing here today." The crowd grew even quieter. A woman near the parking meter lowered her phone slightly, her expression thoughtful now rather than curious. Carter ran his hand across his chin, glancing again at the hose lying silent across the sidewalk and the shallow water still drying on the pavement. The playful moment he had started earlier now felt distant, replaced by something far more serious. Angela Brooks remained calm in the center of the scene, her posture steady, her voice level as she said one final sentence that carried clearly through the warm afternoon air. "And every choice an officer makes in public becomes part of the story a community remembers." The quiet on Maple Avenue stretched longer than anyone expected, the kind of silence that settles over a place when people realize they are watching something important unfold. The afternoon sun reflected softly across the damp pavement, and the last thin traces of water from the earlier spray continued to dry along the curb. Angela Brooks stood calmly beside the hose that now rested motionless on the ground, her faded canvas bag against her hip and the small notebook still in her hand. The pages fluttered once in the warm breeze before she slipped it carefully back into the bag. Officer Daniel Carter remained a few feet away, his patrol car behind him, the once casual confidence in his stance replaced by something far more measured. He looked toward the gathering crowd again. Several people still held their phones up, but now their expressions carried a quiet seriousness rather than curiosity. The entire street seemed to be listening. Carter finally spoke, his voice lower than before. "You have been watching this neighborhood," he said slowly, "but you never spoke to anyone about it." Angela tilted her head slightly, considering his words. Observing is part of understanding, she replied calmly. People behave differently when they believe they are being evaluated. A faint sound of traffic drifted from the intersection a block away, but along this stretch of sidewalk the moment remained still. Carter shifted his weight and looked briefly toward the storefront windows that reflected the scene back toward him. In the glass he could see the same image the crowd was seeing now. The quiet street, the silent hose, the damp pavement, and a woman standing calmly, while dozens of phones recorded every second. Angela reached into her bag once more, but this time she pulled out something smaller, a slim device about the size of a cell phone. She turned it slightly, so that the small indicator light along the edge became visible in the sunlight. Carter's eyes narrowed. "That is recording," he said quietly. Angela nodded once. "It has been recording for the last 15 minutes, she answered without raising her voice. A soft murmur moved through the crowd again. The device in her hand did not look dramatic, but the steady blinking light carried its own quiet weight. Carter looked down toward the pavement where the water had been spraying earlier. The scene replayed silently in his mind. The laughter, the hose, the phones appearing along the sidewalk. He exhaled slowly and looked back up at Angela. For the first time since the encounter began, the tone in his voice shifted away from defensiveness. "You planned this," he said, though it sounded less like an accusation and more like realization. Angela shook her head gently. "No," she replied. "What happened today was entirely your choice." The breeze moved again through Maple Avenue, stirring a loose flyer taped to the window of the convenience store. A few drops of water slid from the edge of the hose and disappeared into the street. Carter glanced once more at the crowd and the raised phones. Then he looked back at Angela Brooks, standing calm and composed under the warm Alabama sun, while the small recording device continued blinking steadily in her hand. The entire block seemed to understand now that this quiet afternoon had become something far bigger than a simple moment on a city sidewalk. The small recording light on Angela Brooks's device continued blinking steadily in the quiet afternoon air, a soft pulse of red that seemed far louder now than the rushing water had been earlier. Officer Daniel Carter stared at it for a long moment, the meaning of that tiny signal settling slowly across his expression. The warm Alabama sun reflected off the damp pavement around their feet, and the street that had once felt casual and noisy now felt like a courtroom without walls. The crowd remained where it stood along Maple Avenue, phones still raised, their attention focused entirely on the calm woman standing in the center of the scene. Carter shifted his stance slightly, the leather of his duty belt creaking faintly as he moved. He glanced toward the patrol car behind him and then back at Angela. "You said that device has been recording for 15 minutes, he said carefully. Angela nodded once. "Yes," she replied simply. Carter exhaled slowly and looked down at the hose lying across the sidewalk, its thick rubber length still damp from the earlier spray. The moment replayed silently in his mind again, but this time he saw it the way the cameras had seen it, the way the witnesses had seen it. When he lifted his head again, his voice carried a different tone. "Is that the only recording you have?" he asked. Angela studied him for a second before answering. "No," she said calmly. The quiet words seemed to shift the air again. Carter's eyes narrowed slightly. Angela reached into her canvas bag once more and pulled out her phone, holding it up just enough for him to see the screen. Several video icons appeared across the display, each marked with a timestamp from the same afternoon. "Public streets have a way of documenting themselves," she explained softly. "And today there are many perspectives." Carter glanced quickly toward the crowd. At least half a dozen phones were still pointed directly at him. A teenager near the bus stop raised his device a little higher when he noticed the officer looking in his direction. The realization seemed to settle heavily across Carter's shoulders. The moment that had begun as casual entertainment had now turned into something permanent. Angela lowered her phone again and placed it gently back into the bag. She did not raise her voice or move closer. Instead, she remained exactly where she had been standing since the beginning. "The purpose of my work," she continued quietly, "is not to embarrass anyone. It is to understand how power is used when no one believes they will be questioned." Carter listened without interrupting. The faint hum of traffic from the next block drifted through the warm air, but the small stretch of Maple Avenue where they stood remained still. A few of the bystanders exchanged glances with one another, their expressions thoughtful now rather than entertained. Carter looked down briefly, rubbing his hand across the back of his neck again before speaking. "If I were to ask you what happens next," he said slowly, "would you already know the answer?" Angela gave a small nod. "Yes," she said. Carter let out a quiet breath. "And what is that answer?" Angela Brooks met his gaze calmly, the steady patience in her expression unchanged. "That depends on whether today becomes a lesson," she replied softly, "or a report." The words settled into the quiet afternoon like the final piece of a puzzle, leaving the officer standing beside the silent hose while the watching street waited to see which choice he would make. The quiet tension that settled across Maple Avenue lingered in the warm afternoon air like the final seconds before a storm breaks, except nothing in the sky moved and nothing on the street made a sound. Angela Brooks stood exactly where she had been from the beginning, the faded canvas bag resting against her side and the small recording device still blinking steadily in her hand. Officer Daniel Carter looked at her for a long moment, the earlier certainty in his posture now replaced by something far heavier. Around them the crowd remained still, their phones raised but their expressions different now, more thoughtful than curious. The sun reflected softly off the damp pavement where the water had sprayed earlier, turning the sidewalk into a mirror that held the image of everyone standing there. Carter slowly lowered his gaze toward the ground and drew in a long breath before speaking again. His voice was quieter than before, the edge gone from it. "If I wanted today to become a lesson," he said slowly, "what would that look like?" Angela watched him carefully, not rushing to answer. A warm breeze passed down the street, lifting a loose paper flyer on the convenience store window before letting it fall back against the glass. Somewhere down the block a car door closed, but the people gathered along this stretch of sidewalk did not move. Angela finally slipped the recording device into the canvas bag and folded her hands lightly in front of her. "A lesson begins with recognition," she said calmly. "Recognition that people standing on this sidewalk deserve the same respect as anyone else." Carter nodded faintly, the motion small but visible. He glanced toward the crowd again, seeing the faces of neighbors, passers-by, and strangers who had witnessed everything from the beginning. Several phones were still recording, the small screens glowing quietly in the sunlight. Angela continued speaking in the same steady tone. "Authority carries weight," she said. "But that weight exists to protect the community, not to entertain it." Carter remained silent for a moment. His shoulders rose slightly as he inhaled, and then settled again as he exhaled. When he finally looked up, his voice carried a different kind of seriousness. "Then I suppose the first step is acknowledging that what happened here should not have happened," he said. Angela did not smile or react dramatically. She simply nodded once. The simplicity of the gesture seemed to ease something in the air around them. Carter turned slowly toward the fire hydrant and the long hose, stretched across the sidewalk. He bent down and began gathering the thick rubber line, coiling it carefully so it would no longer block the path. The action was quiet and deliberate, and the crowd watched without speaking. When he finished, he carried the hose toward the hydrant and secured it neatly beside the valve before straightening again. Angela observed the movement calmly. The damp pavement around her feet had begun to dry under the sun, leaving faint outlines where the water had once spread across the concrete. Carter stepped back toward his patrol car and then looked again at Angela Brooks. His voice was calm now, no longer defensive. "I understand what you meant earlier," he said quietly. "Public spaces remember things." Angela met his gaze with the same composed expression she had carried all afternoon. The crowd along Maple Avenue remained silent, watching the moment settle into place, while the quiet street held the memory of everything that had unfolded beneath the warm Alabama sun. The last coil of hose rested neatly beside the fire hydrant, and the sidewalk that had once been filled with splashing water now lay almost completely dry under the steady Alabama sun. Maple Avenue slowly began to breathe again. A car rolled through the nearby intersection, its tires humming softly against the warm pavement, and somewhere farther down the block a door opened and closed. Yet the people gathered along the sidewalk remained where they stood, as if they understood they had just witnessed a moment that would linger long after the afternoon ended. Angela Brooks adjusted the strap of her faded canvas bag and looked quietly down the street. The small recording device inside the bag had stopped blinking now, its job finished for the moment. The leather holder with the federal badge rested safely in the front pocket. She had not raised her voice once during the entire encounter, and she had not taken a single step backward. Officer Daniel Carter stood beside his patrol car, his posture noticeably calmer than it had been earlier. The confident grin that had once filled the moment had been replaced by a thoughtful stillness. He looked down the sidewalk where the water had sprayed before, the faint outlines on the pavement now fading as the heat continued to dry the concrete. After a few seconds he spoke again, though this time his voice carried a tone that was different from anything the crowd had heard before. "I understand now," he said quietly. "The way people act when they believe a moment is small can say more than the moment itself." Angela turned back toward him, meeting his gaze without tension. She gave a small nod, the gesture simple and calm. "Moments are never as small as they feel," she replied. "They shape how communities remember the people who serve them." The bystanders nearby lowered their phones slowly. Some of them exchanged glances with one another, their expressions thoughtful. What had started as something that looked like entertainment had turned into something far more reflective. Carter looked toward the people gathered along Maple Avenue, and then back at Angela Brooks. The street felt quieter now, but not tense. It felt settled, as though something important had been understood. He placed one hand lightly on the roof of his patrol car and spoke once more. "I will remember this moment," he said. Angela Brooks studied him for a second and then offered a calm, respectful nod. She did not lecture him further, and she did not repeat the lesson. Instead, she simply turned toward the sidewalk and began walking slowly down the block. Her steps were steady, the canvas bag moving gently at her side as she passed the small convenience store and continued toward the corner where the sunlight stretched across the street. The crowd parted naturally to let her pass. No one spoke as she walked by, but several people watched with quiet respect. When she reached the end of the block, she paused briefly at the crosswalk, waiting for a car to pass before stepping into the street. Behind her, Maple Avenue slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm. The hose remained neatly secured beside the hydrant, the pavement almost completely dry now. Officer Daniel Carter stood beside his patrol car for another moment, looking down the quiet street where Angela Brooks had disappeared around the corner. The afternoon sun continued to shine over the block, but the memory of what had happened there lingered in the still air, a quiet reminder that respect, once challenged, has the power to reshape the way a community sees itself.